Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David E.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Jarrett Keohokalole.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yunji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Happy Aloha Friday. Thanks so much for tuning in here to Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Yunji Denise, joined by Yunji Denise. Excuse me. And we're live this morning on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. This morning, we begin a conversation and spotlight the issue of affordable housing and the issue that seemingly comes up every campaign season. We've heard a number of different solutions proposed by candidates, but this time we're going to be steering the conversation in almost a new direction with a new idea that has come forth.
Yeah, so interesting. We know State Senator Stanley Chang has been at the forefront of this issue. He led a delegation to Singapore to look at what they've done with housing there. This time he headed in another direction, leading a group to Vienna. And so Senator Stanley Chang and Senator Jarrett Keohokalole join us now, just back from Vienna. Thank you both for being here this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Senator Chang, I want to start with you. Let's talk basics. Why Vienna?
Vienna has one of the world's most famous public housing systems. It's been famous for about 100 years. So basically, after the end of World War I, the empire had collapsed. A new government was elected that was very focused on rebuilding the devastated city. And one of the things that they did was to go on a huge spree of public housing construction, 65,000 units in just 10 years. And with the interruption of the war, they basically haven't stopped. And even to this day, they build about 7,000 new units per year. These are all government housing. These are all social housing. And it's one of the world's most famous and successful models that successfully houses about 60% of the population. So we really wanted to check it out for ourselves.
And Senator, if you can talk a little bit, excuse me, Jared, you're both senators, sorry. But Jared, if you can talk a little bit more about this delegation, who was included, and some of the things that maybe surprised you upon your visit there.
Thank you. It was a pretty diverse delegation. There were housing advocates. There were members of the homeless community, 4 state senators. There were members of the business community. So I think Stanley did a pretty good job of bringing together diverse perspectives, other legislators from different states on the East Coast and the West Coast. I think the one takeaway for me was that the program, the system that they run works. It is credible. They've been doing it for 100 years. And by any livability ranking that's out there in the world, the city of Vienna ranks at the top. In fact, The Economist, which is an international business magazine, does an annual livability ranking, and they judge all these different factors: affordability, infrastructure, the nature of the city. The city of Vienna has ranked in the top 2 in the world in livability 6 out of the last 7 years. So if there's one takeaway, it's that the housing program that they do has been accepted by the community there, and you cannot deny that it works for them in Vienna.
That's very interesting. I want to stick with you. And if you could take on this viewer question, and then Senator Chang will toss it to you as well. I'd love to get both of your takes. Miguel says, Vienna has the space, Hawaii doesn't. How do they do housing? We have a density issue here, but is that true? Does Vienna have more space than us? And how are they using the space that they do have?
So yes and no. The city of Vienna is 2 million people, so it's substantially larger than the city of Honolulu. The other thing that they have accepted is density. The overwhelming majority of the public housing provided is actually, Stanley can correct it. It's all apartments. The big difference here is cost. The units that are provided are in good condition. They are quality developments, and people rent, and they are affordable rents. And the community over there has accepted that that's a viable way to live. And as a result, they have an entire building, construction, and societal ecosystem and culture around living in rentals. 75% of Vienna lives in rental apartments. 60% of them are public housing. And there's a standard of quality and livability that they've set in that community that everyone is bought into. It's a cultural thing there.
Senator Chang, what would you say to that density issue that the viewer brought up?
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that Jarrett just said. Vienna is actually the only major world capital that has vineyards, agriculture in the city limits. So they actually do preserve a lot of their agricultural and open space. But what they do that's different from here is that they do take unnecessary and surplus government lands. And there's a widespread consensus that those lands need to be used for high density housing development. So for example, we visited an old airfield, about 600 acres, and that is being used for high density and mixed use housing with an artificial lake, a train system, really fantastic amenities. But, they don't have the same, if they have surplus lands like an old train station that's not being used, they don't talk about those, units or those parcels being used for entertainment districts or whatever. They understand that the need is for housing, and that's why that's what they prioritize.
And Senator Chang, I think one of the things that many people are worried or concerned about is just the way that this would look here in Hawaii with the density issue. We've seen some of the renderings that have come about as the discussion continues on about Aloha Stadium and what that would look like, that property of adding all of those types of units into one central space. But you shared earlier that, upon your visit, there are walkable communities, and it looks a lot different than what the public may stereotypically think of when they think of all these units in one space.
Yeah, so Senator Keohokalole just mentioned the livability aspect. And so that 600-acre former airfield, they picked the winning designer because it had an artificial lake in it, because they wanted the recreational opportunities that lake and the livability and the scenery and the integration with nature that lake offered. The other photo that you saw in the foreground, so this is a former train station. As you can see, it's very walkable. There are, apartments on both sides, but they integrate a lot of retail into the ground floor so that there's a community sense. We saw, right in this photo, underneath the train tracks, you have a play area for kids and for exercise. That wooden building in the back, you have apartments on top, but on the ground floor level, you have a public library. It's high density, but it's very livable. It's very walkable. There's tons of amenities in it. And I think the philosophy of the government is we're not just building warehouses for people. We want people to enjoy a really good quality of life with dental clinics and doctors' offices and retail and public libraries and exercise facilities and everything that you would need in your life really integrated into a short walk away from your apartment.
Senator Keohokalole, I'm wondering if you can tell us just the experience of walking through those spaces. You talked about the quality of life and the economists saying that they have, a pretty high standard of it there. When we think, what the senator was saying, just this idea that we would be warehousing people. Tell us about how this didn't necessarily feel like that.
It was honestly frustrating to go through those developments because of how nice they were, and to compare them to the experience that we've been having to try to make affordable housing work in Hawaii. The reality is what we've done to ourselves is created a system where there's so much incentive for the development and construction community to build luxury that we don't get the same type of input from our construction community, our entire ecosystem around building these types of projects. That airfield project is not much smaller than Ko'olina. And what they have over there are tens of thousands of affordable units around recreation. There's solar on top of their rail station, and there are parks and playgrounds underneath. They've been able to make it work really well. When they put out a request for proposal from the development community, they get 30 developers that go in and bid on these projects, which is why they end up getting why they end up getting a lot of these amenities and quality. We need to restructure the way our construction industry and community is tailored to develop housing. It's too far skewed into the luxury classes, in my opinion. And part of it is this pivot back to rentals and density development that people can actually afford.
Senator Chang, if we can kind of dive into the nuts and bolts of how this would look on the financial aspect and the burden that it would be to taxpayers, to the state, to be able to take on some of this cost of not only working with the construction industry and developers, but just in the overall maintenance. How much would this cost to realistically accomplish?
So we think of, the lavish amenities and the gorgeous design of Vienna, but believe it or not, it actually costs less, both in absolute terms and per capita, substantially less than we spend in Hawaii. The difference is not that they spend more, it's that they spend more wisely or intelligently. And I'll just give you one example that has made a huge difference in Vienna. So the principal form of affordable housing finance in the United States since 1986 nationwide is a program called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC. And that's a grant to the developers here in Hawaii. So the government pays for 40 to 70% of the building, but owns zero. The developer pays for zero, but owns 100%. And when the developer sells, they often make, a windfall profit. They get to keep all of the proceeds. In Vienna, they don't give the funding as a grant. They give it as a loan. So the developer has to pay it back at a low interest rate over several years. It's a long-term loan of 40 years. And the eligible developers are the separate class of company called limited profit housing associations that are able to make a profit, a 3.5% profit, but then they're required to spend that profit only on developing new housing. So the capital recycles and recycles and recycles over and over again. So you have the government initially puts in an amount of money, but it's a self-perpetuating system. It's a perpetual motion machine. Which is why today, one of the most astonishing statistics that I learned in Vienna was that almost no new taxpayer dollars go into housing construction subsidies the way that LIHTC does here in Hawaii. And if you're all familiar, this year the legislature appropriated $300 million into the rental housing revolving fund, $600 million into the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. This is big bucks compared to Vienna, which does close to zero for housing construction subsidies.
That's very interesting, but thinking about how would we make that shift here, I would think that there would be a lot of developers who would be pretty skeptical of wanting to enter the kind of funding mechanism that you're talking about. How easy or difficult of a sell do you think that'll be?
So change is always difficult. And when the LIHTC system was implemented back in 1986, that was actually a big change too. And at first, nobody wanted to do LIHTC projects, either in the finance or the development community. I think one simple change that we could make is, instead of giving developers ownership of these projects, instead having the state act as the developer and hire private sector developers on a fee basis to actually deliver the buildings. So, we talk to developers all the time, and obviously people need to be compensated for the work that they perform. And I think one model would be to pay, say, a 10% developer fee for actually delivering units, rather than giving a developer the entire ownership of the unit. And what that means is that the state can retain the equity, and as that building appreciates over time, the state can then further leverage that equity to build more units in the future.
Senator Keohokalole, I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on where exactly you think something like this would be realistic here on the island of Oahu. I know you had mentioned it's the size of Ko'olina, but given the scarcity of space in some of our areas, where could you see something like this realistically happening here on Oahu?
So that was a giant master plan community, and it was a really outlier example of what they do. They acquire parcels every year, which has been a discussion that we've had on Oahu in the transit-oriented development corridor for years and years. Ultimately, I think probably about 75% of what they do in Vienna, we already do here in the state of Hawaii through tax credits, through the HHFDC and our different affordable housing programs. The main difference is the standard that the community has and the expectation that they have to have low-cost affordable housing. They've just been able to tailor their system in a way that works better than we do. The ultimate reality in Hawaii is that the real incentive to deliver housing, if you're a developer, because I don't think it's any one individual's fault that we're in the situation we're in. It's there's just too much risk and too much expense in the way we've developed the system to build for affordable classes, and it's too lucrative to build upper, higher, super luxury and developments. And that's the systemic change that we just have to do in pieces over time, I think, in order to get from here to there.
I want to stick with you on that thought. What is the first piece? We know that you both are preparing for the upcoming session. What realistically do you think you could do to start to take some steps to not necessarily entirely replicating this model, but kind of adopting some of the best practices?
Well, it's some of the things that Stanley mentioned. The concept that really exists everywhere in Vienna that I think we need to have a broader and longer conversation over is this cooperative ownership model. It's somewhere between rental and owning the condominium. The American system is so tailored toward home ownership, and it's so lucrative over time that I think as a community, we're sort of fixated on everybody getting their 4-bedroom house with a picket fence in front. And the reality is we're losing people every year. We're losing our young people, our professional classes, because they can't afford to live anywhere. And many, many thousands of them would live in a rental if it provided them an affordable way of life. And so that's something that we're just going to have to pivot to over time because we're so short on other options. And as a society, I don't think we want to just pave over the rest of Hawaii. We need to pursue a different model. And this is one, and it works.
And Senator Chan, what practically is it looking like, maybe say in the next legislative session? Are there some fundamental bills that need to be introduced, some ways in which processes need to change in order to adopt this sort of system?
Yeah, so I think, we already touched on recycling capital to reform the LIHTC program so that the capital gets reused instead of disappearing each time with each project. We also talked about prioritizing public lands for housing the way that Vienna does. I think another really important shift that they do is to focus their social housing, their government housing, not necessarily on those who can least afford it like we do in Hawaii, but on the middle class. And so a tangible example is that currently Hawaii's finance agency, HHFDC, subsidizes each unit an average of $177,000 per unit. Well, if we're going to be building 10,000 units a year, which is what the demand is, and that would be what it would take to satisfy the demand in Hawaii, that would be $1.77 billion every single year, which the state budget is simply not going to be able to afford. So what they do in Vienna is, instead of focusing on the very lowest income, they focus on the middle class. So these are folks who don't need a deep subsidy. They can pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a home. And if they do, then that $1 stretches a lot further because the buyer or the renter, the tenant, is going to be able to pay for a lot more of that, of the cost of that unit. What it also does is that it makes it much cheaper for rent subsidies. So most of us are familiar with the Section 8 program, the main rent subsidy program we have here in the United States and in Hawaii in particular. Section 8 is currently being used to pay for market rate apartments, which are expensive. In Vienna, their equivalent of Section 8 will pay for the lower cost government and social housing. So again, each of their rent subsidy dollars goes a lot further. They might be able to house 3 families for the price of 1 here in Hawaii. And as a result, they don't have the same severe homelessness crisis that we do here. And so on both ends, whether it's construction subsidies or on rental subsidies, Vienna is able to make their dollar stretch a lot farther. And I think that those are some changes that we need to implement at the legislative level.
I'm interested because, as we mentioned at the top, you led that delegation to Singapore in addition to this one. What are the sort of common denominators between the two? What do you think that both of those, those models, obviously they look different, and that has to do with their geography and just the way that the two systems have sort of tackled this issue. But are there commonalities that you see between the two that they're doing that we're not?
Yeah, so there are a lot of commonalities. They both really focus their public lands on high density public housing development. They both recycle their capital. They don't give away capital to developers. They they do a lot of the integration of services and transportation into the building, so they're not just warehouses full of people. And we were talking about the distinction between rental and ownership. That's one of the main distinctions that people understand, is that Singapore does ownership on a 99-year leasehold basis and Vienna does rentals. But one of the things that I really learned is actually that line is a lot blurrier than we think. Because in Vienna, even though, yes, they are rentals, you actually need to come in with a 25 to 30,000 euro down payment when you move in, which is a lot higher than what a typical security deposit rental situation we would imagine here in Hawaii. And they have rent control and rent protections so that your rent doesn't go up very much. It goes up by only a maximum regulated amount per year. So the rent's never going to shoot up. And on top of that, you can stay as long as you want. And you can even give that rental to your kids and your kids' kids and so on, basically into perpetuity. Whereas in Singapore, the 99-year leasehold model, even if your kids are living in the unit, it reverts to the government after 99 years. So in some ways, you and your family can live in this unit in Vienna in perpetuity. In Singapore, even though you own the unit, you can, and your family can only live there for 99 years. So I would say that the distinction between rental and ownership is a lot blurrier than what we might think of here in America, where it's like very cut and dry what the distinction is.
Senator Keohokalole, a lot of this conversation that we've had has been maybe concentrated more on Oahu, but we know that this is an issue for residents throughout the state, that this housing issue is not just confined to the island of Oahu, but many residents on the neighbor islands are also suffering and want to find places and have housing as an option. Is this something that could be done statewide and looking at maybe the neighbor islands to test some of this, where, say, somewhere on the Big Island, they have more availability of land and maybe some other models where it's not as many people. But what has the conversation been like on a statewide level to support this need?
So, we actually went to the outlying county outside of Vienna, which was more rural in nature, and they have a much similar program. Again, I think to Stanley's point, in America, we're so fixated on home ownership. It's been difficult for us to decouple that concept from, I think, the core objective that we really need to address in Hawaii, which is we have to address the shortage of overall housing. We just have far too much demand. There are too many families that would take units that are available if they could only find them. And when you're spending upwards of 40 or 50% of your monthly household income on housing costs, for those families, the difference between renting or a co-op or a fee simple property doesn't really make that much difference. I have 3 little kids. We're trying to make the mortgage every month. My brother has 2 little kids. He's trying to make rent every month. And it's just a matter of whether you can balance out your monthly expenses and find some place that's comfortable for you to live in. So, we got to get away from, in my opinion, the system that we've created for ourselves that has led to this demand situation, and look at other models that are actually working. We don't have to go 100% of the way Vienna does it, but we definitely need to change what we're doing now to move more in that direction, because they address the demand problem that they have in their city, and all of their metrics reflect that. It works there, and the people have come to tolerate that and expect that you're going to have affordable places to live in a city of 2 million people.
I'd like to get both of your takes on what should happen at the stadium site. We know that there is renewed conversation over this. The governor sort of changing the direction of that, saying that DBED should lead the charge there and take away the public-private partnership element of that, just purely building athletic facilities there. Senator Chang, I know that you say that this is a great opportunity for housing in the urban core. What's your take on what should happen to that site at this point?
So I agree completely with what the governor has done. And I understand there may be problems with the communications aspect of it. But the reality is the public-private partnership model to subsidize stadium construction and even operating and maintenance costs really doesn't work. There are a lot of these projects on the mainland. They often make big promises, and many of them, if not most of them, if not all of them, have really fallen short of those promises. So here's some facts. So the parcel is a total of 98 acres. As we all know, most of it is parking lot and not used for the stadium itself. Another thing that not a lot of people know is that what was there before the stadium was actually public housing. So they actually demolished a bunch of low-income housing to build the stadium in the first place. Stadiums don't need a lot of land. The Chicago Bears, an NFL franchise, plays in a stadium that is 8 acres in size. Other, stadiums are in the 10 to 15 acre range. Out of the 98 acres, that would leave, 85, 83 acres that could be used for housing. Developed at the level of density that we see in communities like Hong Kong or Singapore, you would be able to get, tens of thousands of housing units, and solve a decade or even more worth of housing demand on just one parcel alone. And I understand that there are a lot of challenges and obstacles before we get there. Obviously, the infrastructure capacity there is not adequate currently. The height limits there set by the city are far too low. But those are all things that can be changed. And I believe that they must be changed because the stadium is a perfect example of how you can build high density model with a lot of mixed use, all of those great things that we saw in that former airfield with the photos earlier today, with a car-free community. These people would be relying entirely on public transportation and on walking because there's a rail station that's already right there on site. It's a win-win situation. And we actually see situations like this in a lot of communities. The Happy Valley Racecourse in Hong Kong is one great example where there's a large athletic facility surrounded by housing. That is actually some of the most desirable housing in Hong Kong.
And Senator Keohokalole, your thoughts on the stadium and what should be used there?
We need housing there. It's been really discouraging to go back and forth on the site. I would love to have a stadium again where we have Friday night lights. I played football there in high school. It was great. But we cannot, if there's one lesson that I learned from Vienna, it's that community expectation really should drive the way the housing system works. And what they've done over there has worked for 100 years. So there's just an expectation that when these large parcels of state land open up, that there are projects that are going to be built there to provide housing for the community. It's going to be designed in a way that makes sense for the community, for people that work and live there, to raise their families there in a way that makes sense. And it's just different from the way we do it now. The expectations for the stadium are, at this point, they've gone in so many different directions. We have to just pick one and go forward on it. I think that's what the governor is attempting to do. But at the end of the day, having an entertainment district and somewhere for the football team to play is great. But we need housing. Who's going to watch the games? If the only people that can afford to live here are living here 20 weekends a year as a second home or retirement venue, we need places for young families and for kupuna who are from here and want to live here to stay. And if that means that they have to adjust to a life without a vehicle, that's not outside the realm of possibility when your only other alternative is to move to Las Vegas or Arizona or somewhere that's not Hawaii. So we can do it. We just have to commit to it collectively.
Senator Chang, I want to give you the last word. We've got about 2 minutes left in our program this morning. The half hour goes fast. What are the next steps now? We know that you've gone to Singapore, you've gone to Vienna. How do you share this knowledge with the rest of your cohort at the capital and also with the wider community? Tell us about what we can expect from your visit up until this point.
Yeah, so, these have been such great, enriching learning experiences because, as Jarrett's mentioned, we already do a lot of what the Singaporeans, what the Viennese do. We just need to go that extra step. And I'm personally very optimistic because, as we all know, we have a new gubernatorial administration coming in by the end of this year. And whoever gets elected, there's certainly a mandate for housing, whether it's on your program, whether it's on other networks or other media outlets, the first question to all the gubernatorial candidates is always about housing. We have a deep need, 65,000 units, 100,000 units, 10,000 units a year. And the people expect that the next administration is going to come in, hitting the ground running, delivering thousands and thousands of new units per year. And that is going to be step one. And luckily, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We already have a lot of the systems that are in place today. We need to make some additional tweaks. We need to put into practice some of the lessons that we've learned. But I am cautiously optimistic that we can learn from our mistakes of the past. We can learn from the best practices from around the world. And I believe that this next administration will be the administration that ends our housing shortage. And that, for example, the over half of all Native Hawaiians that live outside of Hawaii, many of them will be able to come back to Hawaii, and every future generation will be able to call Hawaii home.
All right. We thank both of you for being on this morning and sharing your knowledge and your experience in Vienna. And we look forward to seeing what happens as this conversation about affordable housing in Hawaii continues. Thank you so much for spending your Friday morning with both of us. Aloha.
Thanks for having us.
Wow, very interesting, Ryan. I love the pictures off the top, and just inspiring to hear about what they've been able to do in other places around the world. You have to appreciate the drive of Senator Chang for taking these delegations on these trips and really trying to explore other models to see what they are doing right and how that could be done differently here. You heard both of the senators talk about how there needs to be really a shift in thinking on how we look at housing, that perhaps home ownership isn't the ultimate goal, but that having a nice, affordable place to live suffices. And so, of course, we all want to own a home and the picket fence and all the things they talked about. But on the flip side, that goal is unattainable for the vast majority of, the people that we're talking about trying to get into housing. So how do we do this quickly so that Hawaii families can stay here? These two communities, Vienna and Singapore, are offering some different solutions and outside of the box thinking.
Yeah, and it's not only the thinking that needs to change from the perspective of the potential buyers or those who would be living in these units or the renters, but it also is about the developers and the model in which would need to shift, in the way in which the relationship between the state and these private developers would have to change in order for it to not necessarily be in favor of the developers. And it would cause, I think some of the developers some uneasiness to make that transition, of course, but it's something that needs to happen in order, as they say, for the real change to happen. It really is the shift in mentality overall about how we look at housing here in Hawaii. A very interesting conversation. If you've missed any portion of it, again, we encourage you to go back and watch it on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser as a podcast, or catch the rebroadcast on television this evening or throughout the weekend on Channel 50.
That's right. And coming up on Monday, we're going to be switching the conversation back to the coronavirus. COVID-19 across the world, we've seen new variants popping up, what our expectations are for the fall, and also the vaccine uptake with the new bivalent vaccine. They're not seeing the numbers that I think a lot of public health officials had hoped for. So what does this all mean for the months ahead, especially for us here in Hawaii? We're going back to the expert, one of our favorites, Dr. Tim Brown from the East West Center. He tracks trends around the world. He is an infectious disease expert. And so we'll be asking him about what his expectations and some of his predictions are. And also, he's been looking at some studies regarding long COVID. We're going to ask him about that as well. So join us for that conversation right here on Monday for another edition of Spotlight Hawaii. Have a great weekend.
Aloha. We'll see you then.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.